You're listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. I'm Aaron Goodman. Can public spaces ever truly be safe for people with multiple chemical sensitivity? Why are so many buildings, workplaces, schools, and public environments designed in ways that exclude people with environmental sensitivities? My guest today is Aimi Hamraie, Canada Research Chair in Technology, Society, and Disability, and Associate Professor at York University in Toronto. Aimi's work explores disability justice, accessibility, architecture, and design, including how public spaces can include or exclude people with disabilities, including people with MCS. Together, we discuss living with MCS, the hidden barriers many people face in classrooms, workplaces, and healthcare spaces, and why accessibility conversations often overlook air quality, fragrance exposure, and MCS. We explore how barriers to safe public spaces have left many people with MCS feeling pushed out of urban environments, sometimes relocating to places like Snowflake, Arizona, where communities of people with MCS have settled in search of safer living conditions. We also discuss how people with MCS and chronic illness created online community spaces long before COVID, and what the pandemic revealed about remote access as a vital form of accessibility. And we consider what truly MCS-inclusive design could look like in homes, schools, workplaces, and public life. Please check out and share a link for the podcast's new webpage. It's listen.chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Please share the link with anyone in your life who may be interested in learning more about MCS. And please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more, follow the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. And you can reach me at aaron@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Thanks for listening. Aimi, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Really grateful to you for taking the time. You mentioned before that you have some experience with MCS. If you're open to it, would you like to talk about any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I identify as a disabled person, and I'm autistic. I have chronic illnesses and chronic pain. And I came to realize that I probably had MCS in my early 20s when I met other disabled people who were having experiences that were like the ones I'd been having for years, but I didn't really have language for, that my doctors didn't really seem to understand. And so, I'm really grateful that I found community when I did, because I also learned about all these different accessibility practices, like the fact that you can actually ask people not to wear fragrances when they're around you, or, I remember having a whole conversation with my parents long after I'd moved out of their house about what laundry detergents and cleaning products and stuff they use. It's something that's, it's just been with me for a long time, and it's improved my life quite a bit to be able to facilitate access around, and to kind of like create a home for myself where my exposures are more limited and I can kind of do things and feel more alert and less sick than I did before.
It's really interesting. You mentioned that the time it can take to understand what's happening in one's body.
Yeah. Especially when you're a younger person. And, I grew up in a world where disability wasn't really part of like the public discourse. And if it was, represented in really particular ways. Something like environmental illness, which is already like for so many people, it seems kind of vague or unknowable. it was really hard to pinpoint. Then I found people who helped me do that. And I also, in my research, in the research that resulted from that, kind of learned about histories of people organizing around MCS. And it was really powerful for me because I was like, oh, okay, it doesn't have to be this experience of like an individual person on some kind of medical journey. It's actually something that people can come together around. And when I started my first academic job, I actually had this experience where every time I would walk into the building where my office was, I would get really sick. Like my eyes would start watering, my nose would be running. People always thought I was crying because it was so extreme. And I started to talk to my coworkers about it, and it was really interesting because all the women were like, oh yeah, that happens to me too, but no one ever believes me. And the women in that office were the ones who tended to work out of their offices more often, and the men tended to be doing other things and being outside of the office. And so we, in talking to each other, we were able to like get the university's facilities department involved, and they came and did all these air quality tests, and they figured out, like, I was like the miner's canary in this situation. They figured out that because it was winter and the heat was on, they had stopped allowing any airflow into the building because it's more energy efficient to not let in fresh air. But there was a really high level of CO2 in the building, and that's why I was experiencing what I was, because I already I'm very sensitive and I have asthma and these things. It was more extreme in presentation in my body, but other people were also having brain fog and like all kinds of other symptoms. And so we actually got them to change the policies around air. It's kind of wild to think about, like, everyone's just in there breathing CO2, and then the people who are working in administrative positions and stuff tend to experience like day-to-day harm from it. And so,
and I imagine fragrances too, people's personal care products that they're bringing in, there's nothing being washed out.
Yeah, absolutely. I was masking long before the pandemic started because it was one of the only tools I had, especially at work or like places like the airport, on airplanes, like, where you're just sharing air in such close proximity. And so it was really interesting kind of when the pandemic started to already have all these tools in place, like have air purifiers and HEPA filters to be able to help other people figure out how to access those things too.
Yes, as you say, people with MCS have been masking and thinking about air filtration long before.
Yeah.
And in your day-to-day, Amy, as an educator and researcher, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that many others also experience going into work? I'm at, when you encounter these triggers, fragrances, chemicals in the air, what's your day-to-day like these days?
Well, these days, so now where I work, there's actually, like in the buildings that I work in, there are signs everywhere that say this is a fragrance-free space, which is really interesting. I've never seen that in the US, but I've recently moved to Canada, and this is something I appreciate as like, it's just understood as part of, here, disability rights are considered part of human rights, not civil rights necessarily. It's like a different framework. And so they're like, oh yeah, as a matter of human rights, people shouldn't wear fragrances when they're in this building with other people. And so it's like a little bit better in some ways. It's like really, it's interesting to be in a place where it seems normal to say, hey, I'm really sensitive to this thing, could you not use it? Because that was not really my experience previously. I spent a lot of my, higher education years just being like really sick and not knowing why, and missing school, just being like cognitively affected in different ways.
And Amy, do you want to talk about how your experience with MCS has influenced your research?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the first books I ever read about MCS was a feminist indigenous scholar, M. Murphy, wrote a book called Sick Building Syndrome and the Problem of Uncertainty. I'm not sure if you've read it, but it's like this amazing feminist history of science book kind of about the invention of air conditioning and high rises, and then like how all these women office workers especially started to get really sick and organize around MCS. And it was like such a transformative book for me to read when I was like 22 or 23, because I was like having these experiences and meeting other disabled people and then learning about how it connects to this history of feminist organizing. That was also the time in which I started doing research at the intersections of architecture and the history of science on accessibility. I started to think about things like, who is the world built for? And the answer to that is not just like some like vague idea of like a normal person. It's actually very scientific. The information, the evidence that architects and designers use to make buildings or design products or different systems, cars, airplanes, like all of this is really based on statistics of how much space bodies take up. And then to a more limited extent, at different points in history, also understandings of internal bodily systems. So in the 50s and 60s, the industrial design firm Henry Dreyfuss Associates they published this book called The Measure of Man, and then later it became The Measure of Man and Woman. And it was a lot of like anthropometric data about bodies, but then it also included, because it was during the Cold War, it included things like, you have to protect bodies from exposures. It might be chemical, radiation, nuclear exposures, biological weapons. They were like encouraging people to build buildings that like kept the air clean and, had proper filtration and things like that. And so like I became really interested in how, at different times in history, the idea of what human bodies need and do really shifted. And then also, as we get into the kind of disability civil rights era, what considerations of the body do and do not make it into how architects are designing for accessibility. I wrote a book about the history of the universal design movement, which is really like interesting and capacious, and at various times has really debated like what issues are part of this. Historically, mobility access, wheelchair access, and then over time, access for blind people, access for deaf people. There were MCS activists around in the 90s and even in the 80s who were trying to get universal design people to think about issues like air quality, and no one really knew what to do with it. Like there was this kind of like, like this is so vague or unknowable, we don't know if it's real, or it's just so outside the realm of how we tend to practice inclusive design, which is to create more space. But when the issue isn't more space, then there's really a lot of pushback. And I've seen that also like in, the work that I do with like helping to kind of research and create accessibility standards is like on the one hand, there's a recognition that people with MCS exist. And then there's also like, okay, but how do you even create a standard for something like this? One of the conversations that we've had in that space has been like bringing in experts in both in like air quality and ventilation and things like that, and disabled people who have lived experiences of MCS, of like other kind of like respiratory conditions, or people who have long COVID. There is so much scientific research about this actually that we could use to create standards, but it's happening often, like it's like a conversation that happens not so much in the realm of accessibility, but in sustainability. I found like there are sustainability standards for architecture, that are about basically not exposing construction workers to chemicals. So, because there are known health consequences of that. And then by extension, when a building follows those standards, they're going to have low VOCs. They're not going to have like as much off-gassing and things like that. Like these things about like new buildings that make us sick. The sustainability people have really thought about, but for some reason, like the disability access people don't want to think about. So it's been kind of an ongoing conversation, and it's been interesting to like meet people who identify with environmental illness and things like that, like through that process, and to hear about how long they've been advocating for accessibility standards around this. If we think about it, what if the response to the pandemic had been like dramatically improving air quality for everyone? Kids wouldn't get sick at school because they're, all the viruses would get filtered and all these things. It would be just so beneficial for so many people to have better air to breathe. But it's like one of those things where it's like if you have kind of an invisible or non-apparent condition, then it's easier to ignore than to have to, be responsible towards.
I wonder if you want to talk briefly about how people with MCS are not part of that discussion. I think of my own physical spaces at the university where I teach. The windows are very small. If you open them, you're opening to traffic. There isn't really any air filtration at all. So for someone with MCS, there really isn't anything in place to help protect them. And that is, in your view, whose oversight is that?
I think it's a combination of, codes, like building codes, architectural design practices, engineering practices, because, airflow is an engineering issue. And every aspect of airflow is engineered. And so when buildings don't think about ventilation, we really need to have redundant systems. For a lot of accessibility, like you don't want to just have one elevator because what if it breaks? Like similarly with air, it's like, sure, opening a window is great, but also like making sure that your HVAC system has like really like top-notch filtration is really important. Not having a buildup of CO2 and things like that I was talking about before. In some places, these things are regulated by law or by local building codes, and in some places they're not. And that's just like a tricky thing about the built environment in general. There's the building that my office is currently in at school, which I don't really use a lot, but we're building a lab space in there, and it's a brutalist building from the 1960s. It's really beautiful in some ways, like there's like floor to ceiling windows and stuff, but there's no way to open the windows. But because there's no ventilation, we can't do those things in that space and have it be safe for everyone who's there. If there are any architects listening to this podcast, like I think it's just worthwhile to think about why do we create such hermetically sealed spaces. I think the standards have changed since the 60s, of course, because we also know it's like not great for fire and other things, but like there is an opportunity if we follow the lead of like the sustainability people and the standards that they're creating. There's an opportunity to really think about like exposures, airflow, the materials that we're using, like all of these things from the beginning, so that we don't have a situation later where someone's like, I can't even open my window because there's so much smog outside, And then there's the, upstream. It's like, what are all the industries that are making us sick and producing the things that are in the air and the water and that get added to the air that we breathe that, we maybe like less often connect to those sources than to what is immediately around us. But I think it's really important to be able to do both.
How much more work is there to go? And I mean, it's such a huge issue, right? Maybe are there any, perhaps a couple of simple things that come to mind? What could be prioritized to ensure that people because mostly we can't go in public spaces.
Yeah.
Right? Mostly we're excluded.
Right.
We're not part of the design. So what needs to be done to help us be able to access safe spaces?
I mean, it is a big question, and in part because there are people with very different needs, I think, and also like the source of their MCS might be different. But I think if we kind of, I think a lot about like there's so many tens of thousands of people with long COVID now, and what would it mean to even build buildings for long COVID or build a society that uses that as kind of a baseline? And I think it's similar with us. Really prioritizing indoor air quality just seems actually incredibly simple to me. Like, it's like in our homes, we do this. It's scalable. Filtration technology exists. Bee technology exists. We could just like help people not get sick. But if you think about this like politically, like there are all these barriers to it. Like some people would have to admit that any of this is even real or that they should care about it. It seems like some sort of unfunded mandate or something, like if you were to require it legally. And so people don't want to do it. But like we really, like literally everyone, even people without MCS, could just be like breathing better air. And I think that would be amazing. I think also just like, I don't know how to keep people from wearing fragrances and stuff like that on a mass scale, but it is really unfortunate that so many of us have to personally advocate around that constantly. Like it's exhausting.
It is.
And over a lifetime, maybe you find your people that you don't have to advocate for that around. But, like there's been really such great like work in the disability justice kind of world and community around like sharing resources and doing mutual aid around this. Many years ago, the activist Leah Lakshmi Piyapshana Samarasina wrote a guide that I remember reading as a young person that was like basically like how to find fragrance-free products if you're a person of color, and like you need like certain like curly hair products and stuff, which I fall into this category. And I was like, oh, like we can share our knowledge with each other and then give it to other people and they can use it. And it's actually amazing how that guide has traveled over time and people have kind of created their own. And so, it's like I never want to give up on that, like people's infrastructure side of things. At the same time that I really wish we didn't have to work so hard all the time.
What stuns me, Amy, is the lack of awareness that fragrance is actually really harmful for everyone. Do you think there needs to be more knowledge of the harms of fragrance?
Yes. I mean, yeah, especially from the kind of industrial and like production side. Like, yeah, I mean, there are fragrances that like can cause endocrine disruption and things like that. Or they're often like chemical derivatives or like byproducts of other things. I grew up in a home where like people in my household really liked wearing fragrances, and I think that's like part of how I ended up feeling so sick, and then feeling better when I wasn't around them. So there's like that part. There's also like it's like institutions, which are the entities that buy products for masses of people, which is different than like when you go to your friend's house for dinner or something and you bring your own soap to wash your hands with. People aren't always aware that like these little consumer choices affect a lot of people, and that they can spill over and like affect people significantly across time. But then with certain things, we do adapt. So like, for example, like I have a severe peanut allergy. When I was a kid in the 80s, nobody else had that. And so it was like this really annoying thing to have to navigate. Nowadays, from what I understand from my friends who have kids, like everyone's like on top of it, like, nope, no, like everything has to be nut free. And I know people complain about that sometimes, but it's like known that in order to protect people who have nut allergies, you need to have nut options. I think that like my nut allergy probably comes from the same place as my MCS. It's like some sort of mast cell activation. And so like it's like, for me, these forms of access feel really connected. There are other things like that I think,
Like smoking, for example.
yeah,
That's often one
smoking.
that's talked about, right?
Oh, right. We have in many places made smoking indoors illegal, set parameters around smoking outside. And sometimes in disability community, we talk about like, people can have really different access needs. Like some people need to smoke for their anxiety or something like that. And like, creating a space for that, right? Like airports have smoking lounges and stuff, but then like not doing it on the airplane. Similarly, like on the airplane, they used to give out peanuts, but so many people complained that it was an ADA violation. They stopped doing that. So it really does feel like it should be possible to ask people not to wear fragrances, or at the very least not to spray them like when they're in the space right next to you. It's like a very neoliberal thing where we end up having to advocate for ourselves or mask ourselves, like wear masks ourselves, bring our own air purifiers.
It'd be nice if the building design and the people who choose the products and their filtration systems would be more on top of it. And do you think that's coming down the pipeline, across the board? Do you think we can look forward to a day when we won't have to worry about accessing public spaces?
I really hope so, because the research is there and the products are there. It's really about how do you get people to include them in their spaces. Someone might say we should do that through legal channels, which can be active in certain ways to set a baseline. Someone might say we need to create incentives. It's the same with other accessibility measures and products. There are ones that are required by law. There are ones that go beyond the code, but people kind of promote them to builders and designers and stuff. I'm very skeptical of any claim that something is universal, but like breathing is literally universal. Every single person needs to breathe better air. If we were to design systems that reduce chemical exposures, reduce exposures to viruses and things like that, like there would just be so much like greater kind of wellness. People in general would feel better. Kids in elementary school wouldn't get sick all the time. Like we could go into public space.
You talked about, on the one hand, the coming together and the advocacy that Michelle Murphy has written about, right? But we also experience on an individual basis the need or the pressure to advocate for ourselves. And sometimes it often feels like a me problem. It can be very isolating. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that kind of dichotomy between the coming together and the isolation we can experience.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. It's something I experience kind of in different parts of my life where you're like the only one that has this one particular experience. Recently, my lab finished up a project called the Remote Access Archive, where we were studying like how did disabled people find each other remotely, like across long distances, and do things to address isolation. And there's so many examples in that archive of like many different disability communities, blind communities, deaf communities. And I really appreciated and resonated with this incredible set of materials that the community of people with environmental illness in Snowflake, Arizona gave us. They include people who can't use the computer for more than like 5 minutes at a time. And yet they figured out through all these really interesting practices how to run a website, how to have like global newsletters, and really find people. And they don't have to be in the same space. Although sometimes people move to Snowflake, Arizona because they know that there are other people who have similar access needs around them. And I think that that's like, with so many things, what we have to do. And we're lucky to live in this highly connected time where like, yeah, my immediate coworkers may not get this thing, but I can find someone else who gets it. And it can kind of, scale up from there. It's really about building power, I think.
That's amazing. I'd like to hear more about that. And people you mentioned in Snowflake, Arizona, sometimes can't use computers because of electromagnetic radiation, right? Sensitivities to EMF. You write about during COVID, this really compelling example of people having parties, dance parties online.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was a project that we started doing in March of 2020 because so many people like in my lab and in my community, we had to do things remotely for so long. And so we wanted to show like all the things we already know how to do that non-disabled people are sort of doing for the first time. We wanted to kind of make it like fun and festive and create a space for connection. And so we had these Zoom dance parties and people would show art, there'd be music, there was ASL, there was captioning, like all different kinds of like interactive activities and stuff. And it was like, it was really great to just be able to say like, yes, we have been isolated, but we know what to do in this time when so many people did not know what to do and were like, you know, feeling really lost. So it's really kind of like testament to disabled wisdom, I think, that we were able to do that. Lots of other folks have since taken up that model and hosted other parties as well.
And so online access, remote access is really critical for people with MCS, as we know and as you've talked about. Yet we have to, again, advocate for it. It can be challenging to prove that we're actually ill, right, to be able to get that access.
It's like a knowledge barrier and a communication barrier, and also a thing about being believed and taken seriously. It's like even worse for people, I think, who are like racialized or like have some aspect of their identity where like they are doubted in general and like seen as like complaining too much or something like that.
So many people become unemployed or experience homelessness because of accessibility barriers due to MCS, right? And it takes a lot to advocate for oneself, and we need a lot. We need doctors to advocate on our behalf, right? It's very challenging. And so why do you think MCS is often overlooked or left out of conversations around accessibility?
I think that, you know, one of the reasons that I was kind of alluding to before is that accessibility for so long had been in the realm of physical accessibility, and it was tied to specific knowledge bases like anthropometric data about like body size or wheelchair size and stuff. And so when something isn't about space in that way architects or access people perceive it, it's hard to even think about what kind of research they would draw on to create standards and stuff. But then I think the other thing is like, you know, like MCS historically was like considered to be very gendered in some ways, even though we know that's not true. They're like the people who were, for example, like in M. Murphy's book, like organizing around like the workplace and stuff, it was like women who are secretaries. And we know there's so much documentation that like women and feminized people are not believed when they like bring forward their health concerns. And I think that's true of a lot of us who have chronic illnesses too. It's really hard to pin down what it is. And so people don't think it's real. Sometimes people imply that we're making it up or that we're like hallucinating, or I mean, it's even worse for the people who have like electromagnetic like sensitivities and stuff like that. There's just like all these like stereotypes about them and stuff. I think that's why it's like a lack of solidarity. I will say that there's this generation of people who were brought up within a disability justice framework, and I would say the majority of them are people who are chronically ill or have MCS or something like it, and who kind of shifted the framework and said, we can't just think about access in terms of mobility. It's not that we exclude mobility, but there's so many more forms of access out there that we need to explore. And some of the ways that we create access are not by appealing to the government or the state, but by creating like the knowledge networks and practices amongst ourselves that we need to survive. And then from there to figure out how to scale it up. Sharing information about what makes us sick helps the next person. I can think of so many formative conversations I had with people who are like, don't use this cleaner, like it says it's fragrance free, but it's really not. Do this instead. And then like that knowledge, accumulates.
What happens to us psychologically and socially when we cannot go to work, we cannot go to the hospital or the doctor's visit, we can't go to cultural spaces or social gatherings. Many of us experience profound isolation because public spaces are harmful to our health as people with MCS.
It is very painful, and it's very constant. There's sort of this like broad constellation of disabled people who experience these forms of isolation. I would also include people who have like post-viral conditions like long COVID. There's so much isolation, and there's this kind of divide within that too of like who can find community through all these technologically mediated ways and who can't. So, it's like someone like me, or perhaps like you, or someone who's younger than us and is very on social media, may have a certain kind of social life. I grew up with the internet was invented when I was like 10, so it was like part of my life. But I also think of older disabled people, like many of the people who moved to Snowflake, like the work that they have had to do to stay connected is just, it's very intense. One thing is that a lot of people there have to limit their computer use. So they actually develop these like kind of shields and different contraptions so that like the actual computer or the Wi-Fi is like really far away, and then like some part of it gets fed into like a screen like inside or something like that. And there are engineers amongst them who have like helped build this. Some people are able to be more online. So there's like one interview that I did with someone that we did it over Zoom, but others aren't. And so to go back to the isolation thing, like the editor of the EI Wellspring website, we did our interview, and this is how he did it. So he writes with pencil and paper. He puts it in like an envelope or something. A mail courier comes and picks it up. Someone else scans it and emails it to me. I read the email. I respond. It like gets sent back to that email address. Someone prints it. Then they have to let it off gas outside for like 3 weeks, and then he goes and reads it. In his life, the speed of time is really slow. And if I don't respond right away, if I take 3 weeks to respond, suddenly it's 6 weeks before he even gets to read it, And so it's hard to say, are we in community? Because there are all these conditions that worsen isolation in some ways. They have, nevertheless, there's this like insistence on getting their stories out. And so they actually created this whole amazing archive that is digitized, and they will send it to you on like a USB, and you can read, thousands of pages of newsletters, and there are like, architectural plans and different products and like legal things and congressional things. So that impulse to connect is there, even though what it ends up being is imperfect. It's not the same thing as like, oh, let's have a potluck in the backyard, like everything is like in slow motion. It's probably very hard to truly feel connected in ways that would be satisfying. And nevertheless, they've figured out these ways to be really effective, I think.
What do you make of the fact that communities like Snowflake, Arizona exist, and it's because we can't access safe housing, safe medical care, safe public spaces?
I have a lot of different feelings about it, and my answer is kind of informed by also, like, as a queer person, there's a long history of queer people creating rural living arrangements. So where I used to live in Tennessee, there are about 300 people who live on off-grid farms, and they kind of live outside of like the demands of society, but it's safer for them to do that in some ways than to be in cities. And I think like there are disability communities that are like this, where people go off-grid. My friend Corbett O'Toole considers herself part of what is called the nomad community, which is people who kind of drive around in like vans and RVs and live in different places at different times. There are a lot of disabled people in that community. It is true that if cities were more accessible, perhaps people would not have to create these communities. And I think a lot of marginalized people have created sort of like isolated communities or communes or whatever we want to call them because they've had to. And sometimes that's where culture forms. It's an interesting thing about the history of disability is like, you know, if you've ever like read about like the history of institutions or like seen a documentary like Crip Camp, like these places where disabled people are sent to kind of be away from the non-disabled people are sometimes places where they create shared languages, like thinking about the evolution of ASL, shared resources and practices and protocols of living.
Maybe we should just take a quick rewind. You know, there are roughly how many people who've moved there over decades, and it's because of their, you know, they're unable to live in physical spaces in what are standard, correct?
Right. I don't actually know how many people have lived there over time, but I know that people seem to start moving there in the 90s. And this is also kind of when the idea of MCS was also like becoming something that people were talking about more. It was not that long after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And so they were like, you know, it's like disability rights was becoming this thing that people could like claim in certain ways. And yet like people with MCS were both like, seeing that and being like, oh, that's us, but then also being excluded from it. There are some people who started to move there from like California, like from the San Francisco Bay Area, who tried really hard to live in the city or had lived in the city, and then something happened and then they developed MCS and then they moved to Snowflake. And then I think like over time, from what I understand, people would hear about this and then they would move there too. And then of course there are all the people who just like live in that town. And it's right by the Navajo Nation, which is very interesting to me to just kind of think about like also the histories of the way that Indigenous people have been relegated to certain lands, and those lands have sometimes had like different kinds of horrible environmental things happen to them, like, you know, the use of nuclear weapons in the desert and things like that. So there's this like really interesting convergence of people who have been you know, pushed out of certain spaes into others, and they're like in the desert together.
Yes. And I understand the impulse to want to flee. As someone who has lived with MCS for a long time, when workplaces are impossible, when public spaces, because that's what we're talking about, right? When public spaces are no longer accessible, well, where else can one go? If one cannot be where you are, it makes sense to want to flee. And I've talked to people on this podcast from Snowflake and others who've lived in RVs and vehicles. I spoke with a woman in Japan who had MCS, has MCS, lived in her vehicle for 5 years because her family disowned her before taking her in again. Yeah. So what do you make of the fact that public spaces can be so hostile to people with MCS that we have to sometimes take those extreme measures and segregate ourselves entirely or find community outside of urban environments?
I mean, I think it's like it's a thing that people do for survival, not necessarily because they want to. It's very interesting to me that people figured this out. You know, like maybe this is like maybe MCS is something about like modern life that didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. I don't really know, but the fact that like people have figured out there are these environments that can extend our lives or be more accessible, but access is always so, there's like this ambivalence around it. You know, it's like not actually maybe what we would want, but it's what we do to reduce harm. It's like a stopgap. It's like horrible that someone would be disowned by their family or lose their home or have to like live in isolation. That's maybe not what that person would want. public spaces also, I would say, like, are, despite their name, inaccessible to so many people for like so many different reasons. And even though we know that, there's such a sense of betrayal about like the choices that are made that make public spaces inaccessible to us.
Where should the research go next to help reduce the barriers to our access to public spaces?
That's such a good question. I think that, you know, if there are people who are listening to this or reading the transcript who do search on air quality or like, you know, HVAC engineering or something like that, it would be very, very useful if you could do research that could be translated into standards that can be adopted even as voluntary standards, because right now there seems to be the impression that the research doesn't exist or that it's too inconclusive. And so I think it would be really great for people to do some like public education and translational research about how it's not inconclusive, but also to think about how would you set standards and maybe test some standards out in the research. I think that that would just go a long way towards what kinds of products get manufactured, also whether accessibility standards organizations are willing to entertain that this is a type of standard that we can have. I think it's the same with like all of the chemicals that we breathe and that are exposed to. We talked about like fragrances being harmful to people, the carriers of those fragrances, and like all of the ways that they get into our bodies. I know that the research exists about these things, but for some reason there's an impression that it doesn't. So it's an opportunity for those researchers to do kind of more like public facing, maybe advocacy or translational research.
Oh, thank you so much. Amy, would you like to add anything else?
I'm really glad that you're making this podcast. I think it's amazing, and you've had so many incredible guests over time, and I think it's just such a good way to leave evidence that we exist. I think about like my friend Alice Wong, who ran the Disability Visibility Project. Like, what part of what her project did was it left evidence of us so that people in the future could know that we're here, we have all these ideas. I see what you're doing as operating similarly, so I'm really glad to know that it is here, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
I'm really moved to hear you say that. Thank you so much, and thank you for being part of this conversation, Amy. I look forward to sharing it with folks. You've been listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. I'm the host and podcast creator, Aaron Goodman. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast is by and for the MCS community. The podcast is generously supported by the Marilyn Brockman Hoffman Foundation and listeners like you. If you wish to support the podcast, please visit listen.chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Your support will help us continue making the podcast available and creating greater awareness about MCS. To learn more about the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast, follow the podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. And as always, you can reach me at aaron@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Thanks for listening. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast and the associate website are the work of Aaron Goodman and made possible with funds from the Marilyn Brockman Hoffman Foundation, supporting efforts to educate and inform physicians, scientists, and the public about multiple chemical sensitivity. The content, opinions, findings, statements, and recommendations expressed in this Chemical Sensitivity Podcast and associated website do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of its sponsors.